How did a squadron of Australian soldiers, on their very first mission ever fired in anger, lose more men to the jungle itself than to the enemy they were sent to fight? Not one of them died in a firefight. One was gored by a wild elephant. 2 more drowned in a flooded river on a mission so secret that nobody was even allowed to send a helicopter to look for them. And how did their own government manage to keep that entire mission a secret for 31 years, so that the men who fought it grew old, raised families, and buried friends before they were ever allowed to say what they had actually done in that jungle? Tell me in the comments, honestly, can a war be real if the country that fought it insists for 3 decades that it never happened at all? Now let's go. In December of 1962, a small, badly organised uprising broke out in the British Protectorate of Brunei on the island of Borneo. It was crushed within days by British and Commonwealth troops. On its own, it would barely register as a footnote. But it set something larger in motion, along a frontier that would go on to swallow far more attention and far more men than that first brief uprising ever suggested it might. Indonesia's President Sukarno, watching the newly independent states of Southeast Asia arrange themselves into new configurations, saw in the planned Federation of Malaysia something he refused to accept: a British creation, dressed up as decolonization, designed to box his country in. On the 20th of January, 1963, Indonesia's Foreign Minister, Subandrio, announced a policy his government would call Konfrontasi. Confrontation. For a few months that spring, there was still a path away from it. Representatives of Indonesia, Malaya, and the Philippines met at Manila in June of that year and floated a looser regional partnership, Mafilindo, as an alternative to outright confrontation, and in May, Sukarno and Malaya's Tunku Abdul Rahman had already met privately in Tokyo and agreed, at least in principle, that a plebiscite would be held in the Borneo territories before Malaysia was formed. Sukarno promised he would not stand in the way if the people there voted for it. None of that fragile understanding survived the summer. On the 9th of July, the Tunku signed the London Agreement, committing Britain and Malaya to form Malaysia without waiting for any such vote. 18 days later, on the 27th of July, Sukarno answered by launching what he called the Ganyang Malaysia campaign. Crush Malaysia. The Philippines, for its part, never took up arms over the dispute, but it broke off diplomatic relations with the new federation entirely, rather than accept it. Confrontation, in other words, was not, in the strictest legal sense, a declared war. It was something almost stranger, an undeclared one, fought with saboteurs slipped across a jungle border, with a bomb that killed 2 people at McDonald House in Singapore, with propaganda broadcasts and burned embassies, conducted by a government that never once had to stand up and admit it had started a war at all, because admitting that would have meant admitting whose side history was likely to judge harshly. On the 16th of September, 1963, the Federation of Malaysia came into being anyway, built from Malaya, Singapore, and the Borneo territories of Sarawak and North Borneo. Brunei, its would-be third territory, chose to stay out. Indonesian infiltration into Sarawak and Sabah had already begun months earlier, and it did not stop. Through 1964, the confrontation crept closer to Malaya's own mainland, with raids at Lebis and Pontian, convincing the government in Canberra that this was no longer somebody else's quiet border trouble. Australia already had troops stationed in Malaya, part of the Far East Strategic Reserve maintained since the end of the Malayan emergency, a commitment nobody in Canberra had ever expected would end up drawing the country into a second, quieter jungle war on the very same peninsula. In February of 1965, the Australian government committed 2 units to Borneo. The first was the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, a conventional infantry unit that would spend the following 4 months learning the border the hard way. The second was a squadron of soldiers from a regiment that had never once fired a shot in anger. It was called the Special Air Service Regiment. It had been born just 6 months earlier, on the 20th of August 1964, formed by expanding a smaller unit known as the 1st Special Air Service Company, under the command of a major named Gurkha, and modelled deliberately, unapologetically, on the British 22nd SAS. Its soldiers still wore a red beret with an ordinary infantry badge. The sand-coloured beret and winged dagger emblem the regiment is recognised by today would not arrive until the following year. And even then, with most of the unit already committed to Borneo, the first Australians to wear it had to borrow British pattern berets simply because no Australian ones had yet been made. The regiment trained out of Campbell Barracks at Swanbourne, on the outskirts of Perth. It had a proud name and almost no history to back it up. A few names are worth knowing before any of what follows will make proper sense. Major General Walter Collier Walker had been born on the 11th of November 1912 on a tea plantation in Cuttack in British India, into a military family with deep roots in the Gurkha regiments. His own grandfather had once commanded the 1st 8th Gurkhas. Walker fought with Gurkha units in Burma during the Second World War and cut his teeth on counterinsurgency during the long, grinding Malayan emergency of the 1950s, where he had once ordered an ambush group to hold a single position, unmoving, for 28 days. When he returned to Britain from Malaya, he found the government preparing to cut the size of the Gurkha regiments in half, and he did not hesitate to call it, in his own words, a betrayal. In December of 1962, Walker was appointed Director of Operations, Borneo, and it was Walker, more than any other single man, who would design the strategy that shaped everything that followed. A later biographer would call him, without much room for argument, a field commander of genius. In March of 1965, with the character of the war already beginning to shift, Walker was relieved as director by Major General George Lear, a veteran of the Parachute Regiment who had jumped into occupied Europe during the Second World War and had spent 3 years commanding the British 22nd SAS itself during the Malayan emergency. It was Lear who would guide the campaign through its final, more dangerous phase. Major Alfred Barrett Garland, born in Sydney on the 19th of March 1932, was a Korean War veteran who would go on to command the 1st Squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment in Borneo, its first ever combat deployment. Major Jim Hughes, who would later command the 2nd Squadron, had won a military cross in Korea, fought alongside the British in Malaya, and instructed at Sandhurst. A former subordinate described him as short and slight, and nevertheless as tough as leather, and already present in Borneo, already fighting a war years longer than any Australian unit had, were the Gurkhas. Recruited from the hill villages of Nepal, they had been Walker's first, most trusted participants in the most sensitive operations of the entire campaign, alongside the SAS and the Special Boat Service. And it was a Gurkha battalion that 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, relieved on its own arrival at Biao, in Western Sarawak, that same March. None of these men yet knew how tightly their stories would eventually knot together. Right now, they were simply soldiers, Australians new to this particular kind of fighting, stepping into a role that men with a decade more jungle experience had already proven could be trusted with. That role had a name, Operation Claret. It had begun, in embryonic form, around July of 1964, and its purpose was simple to state and difficult to execute. Commonwealth forces would no longer sit passively on the Malaysian side of the border, waiting for Indonesian raiders to choose their moment. They would cross into Indonesia's own territory of Kalimantan, ambush the enemy before he could organise an attack, and deny him the comfort of a safe base to plan from. Walker devised a set of rules to govern it, later remembered by veterans as the Golden Rules. Every mission required his own personal authorization. Only experienced troops could take part, and in the campaign's earliest months, only those on their second tour of Borneo were considered ready. Civilians were never to be put at risk, and no operation was to be run near a populated area. No soldier was to be captured, alive or dead. No identification discs were to be worn. Nothing that could tie a body to Australia or Britain was to be left behind on Indonesian soil. A living prisoner or a recognizable corpse would have handed Indonesia exactly the kind of proof its government could take to the world. So the rule existed less to protect any individual soldier than to protect the fiction the entire operation depended on. Every mission was to be planned and rehearsed for at least 2 weeks before it moved. And the permitted depth of penetration into Indonesian territory grew steadily as the campaign matured, from roughly 2,000 yards in the earliest operations to 6,000 to 10,000 yards by January of 1965, and eventually, for the SAS and the Gurkhas specifically, to as much as 20,000 yards, more than 11 miles inside a country Australia and Britain were not officially at war with. Even now, decades after the fact, nobody has ever produced a complete, agreed count of exactly how many Claret operations were actually run, or precisely what each one was meant to achieve. The paperwork that would answer that question was, by design, never meant to exist in a form anyone could later assemble. That was not an accident of poor record-keeping. It was the entire point of the exercise. A soldier who left nothing behind, who wore no identifying disc, who could neither be captured nor left dead on foreign soil, was a soldier whose government could always plausibly deny he had ever been where the evidence suggested he'd been. The rules were not simply cautious. They were designed, from the very beginning, to make the historical record itself incomplete. The entire strategy depended on one thing above all else: deniability. If Indonesia could not prove the border had been crossed, the fiction that it hadn't could be maintained indefinitely. The first director of Borneo operations would later admit, in his own writing published years afterward, exactly what the strategy had really been designed to do. It was, in his words, the art of hitting an enemy hard by methods which neither escalate the war nor invite United Nations anti-colonialist intervention. This was not a war meant to be won in public. It was a war meant to be denied in public, even as it was quietly being won. And so, the men who carried out this policy were required to lie about where their friends had died. Casualties suffered inside Kalimantan were, as a matter of official government policy, reported to the public as having occurred safely inside Malaysian territory instead. This was the machine now being handed to a regiment that had never used it, and to an infantry battalion beside it that had barely more experience of this particular kind of fighting than the SAS did. What both of them produced first was not the enemy at all. The advance party of the 1st Squadron flew into Brunei on the 16th of February, 1965. The rest of the squadron arrived by ship 2 days later. They moved to Tutong, where British 22nd SAS instructors spent 4 weeks drilling them in techniques the Australians had never trained for. Above all, the 4-man patrol, small enough to move silently, self-sufficient enough to survive alone for weeks at a time. Behind every one of those patrols sat a small, unglamorous logistics chain that made the whole campaign possible. Helicopters from the Royal Australian Air Force's 5th Squadron ferried men and supplies into positions no road could reach, while Hercules transports of 36th Squadron, flying out of Richmond in New South Wales, carried troops and equipment on the long haul between Malaya and Borneo, 6 flights a month, in a war that officially barely existed. Some patrols, before the tour was through, would stay out in the jungle for as long as 89 days at a stretch, living off short rations and whatever the terrain allowed. Their first operational patrols went out on the 28th of March into the upper reaches of the Batang River Valley and into the Pensiangan area of Sabah, where they operated in direct support of the 2nd 7th Gurkha Rifles, an early instance of Australian and Gurkha soldiers working the same ground, on the same mission, under the same impossible rules of secrecy. Much of this early work had nothing to do with ambush at all. Patrols moved through villages, offering medical care and small repairs in exchange for information, and more than once the hospitality shown in return. A meal, a place to sleep, an evening of conversation, delayed an Australian patrol's return far longer than anyone in Brunei had planned for. The people whose trust this work was meant to win belonged mostly to the Iban and Kelabit communities scattered along the border. Longhouse-dwelling farmers and hunters who knew the terrain in a way no outsider, Australian or Indonesian, ever fully would, and whose willingness to pass on word of a stranger's footprints or a boat moving where it shouldn't be was, in the judgment of the officers running the campaign, worth as much as any single ambush. For many of the men on those early patrols, the jungle itself was the first real adversary regardless. Mosquitoes, sandflies, leeches, fire ants, infections that crept into every cut and bite. The kind of ordinary, grinding misery that never appears in an after-action report and killed nobody outright, but wore men down all the same. And then, on the 24th of May, a 4-man reconnaissance patrol moved out toward the Sabah-Kalimantan border. They followed the borderline for 6 days. On the 7th, they crossed it. Nobody could have anticipated what waited for them on the afternoon of the 2nd of June. Crossing a ridgeline deep inside Indonesian territory, the patrol was charged by a wild elephant. Lance Corporal Paul Harold Denhay, the patrol signaller, was gored in the abdomen and thrown into the air by the animal's tusks. He was 21 years old. His 3 companions fired on the elephant and drove it off. But the damage was already done, and there was no way to summon a helicopter without revealing exactly what a 4-man Australian patrol was doing on the wrong side of an undeclared war. Lance Corporal Stephen Bloomfield, the patrol's medic, stayed with him. For days, alone, across an enemy border, tending to a dying friend, while the rest of the patrol tried to make contact with a headquarters that could offer almost nothing in return. The operational log from those days survives. At 9:05 in the morning on the 5th of June, it records a message received from Bloomfield. "Is aid coming? Please when?" Denhay died sometime between the 5th and the 7th of June, 1965, in the jungle, without ever making it back across the line he had crossed a week earlier. He was the Special Air Service Regiment's first ever operational fatality. Not from a bullet, from an animal that had never heard of Konfrontasi, and never would. He was buried in Singapore, and there he has remained. His family petitioned for decades to have his remains brought home to Australia. As recently as 2016, the government's own Veterans Affairs Minister wrote to them explaining he could find no record of the earlier offer of repatriation the family always insisted had been made. His sister would later say she still remembered, vividly, her mother reading that letter aloud, the family's grief still unresolved more than half a century after the jungle had taken him. Because a government that had never fully explained where or how he died had also, for decades, made no serious effort to bring him home. While the SS learned that lesson, 3rd Battalion was learning a different one only a few dozen miles away, in its own base around Bau. Between the 27th of May and the 12th of June, 1965, roughly 120 Australian soldiers, under Majors William Broderick and Ivor Hodgkinson, carried out a series of ambushes along the Sungai Coemba River inside Kalimantan against an Indonesian force known as the 440th Battalion. By the time that series of contacts was finished, an estimated 31 Indonesian soldiers had been killed for 2 Australians wounded. 3 days after it ended, on the 15th of June, a 30-strong Australian platoon under Lieutenant Douglas Byers ambushed roughly 100 Indonesian troops at a place called Kindau. 17 bodies were counted immediately, with as many as 50 believed killed once artillery fire was called onto the position, for the cost of 2 more Australians wounded. And on the 12th of July, a final ambush at a base called Babang, again mounted by 7th Platoon of Charlie Company, killed at least 13 Indonesians and wounded 5 more, without a single Australian casualty, though the intelligence officer accompanying the platoon that day sprang the ambush a fraction early, convinced he had already been spotted, and the withdrawing Australians had to leapfrog their way out of a flanking counterattack under mortar fire before it was over. It was the 4th and final action in a run of successful Claret ambushes that had, across barely 6 weeks, allowed 3rd Battalion to dominate a stretch of border it had arrived on only a few months earlier, without a single man among them having heard a shot fired there in anger. None of these 3 actions were part of Operation Claret's Special Forces chapter, and none of them ever made an Australian headline at the time either, for exactly the same reason the SAS patrols didn't. Officially, none of it was supposed to have happened at all. 3rd Battalion's own losses that tour, 3 men killed, came not from any of these ambushes, but from Indonesian mines laid along paths the battalion patrolled every day. By the time the battalion left Borneo at the end of August, it had carried out 32 separate Claret operations across 4 months, in a stretch of jungle that, on paper, its own government would spend another 3 decades insisting Australian soldiers had never set foot in. The enemy's chance at the SAS came 3 weeks after Denhay's death. On the 21st of June, 1965, Corporal John Robinson led a patrol that guided a full company of Gurkhas, under the command of a British officer named Captain Ashman, roughly 10 kilometres inside Indonesian territory, toward a target village called Lumbis. They walked for 3 days and reached it undetected. Indonesian troops were active inside the village itself, and Ashman deployed his men quietly around its perimeter through the night, mortars and machine guns in place by 6 o'clock the following morning. And then he waited. At 9 o'clock, a gong sounded inside the village, calling the soldiers there to breakfast. Only once a group of roughly 10 men had gathered to eat did Ashman give the order to fire. 4 to 6 of the enemy were killed in the first machine gun burst. Gurkha mortar teams adjusted their aim onto the eating hut itself within seconds, the second salvo tearing straight through its roof. The Indonesians, by every account, were slow to respond, and what fire they did return was ineffective. One shell from the supporting artillery landed so close to the enemy's radio shack that an observer watched its roof lift briefly into the air before settling back into place. By 9:50, Ashman ordered his men to withdraw, and a British 105mm howitzer, positioned 10,000 metres to the northwest, continued shelling the village to cover their retreat. The attacking force made it back to the border just before last light, having spent 3 days walking to reach a target they held under fire for less than an hour. A week later, on the 1st of July, the same squadron planned a strike on an Indonesian airfield deep inside the border at Long Bawan. Warrant Officer Alan Thompson, known to his patrol as Blue, led the reconnaissance element toward the target. 4 days in, roughly 3 kilometres from the airfield, his patrol had taken up a lay-up position when they spotted an Indonesian patrol moving toward them in single file, unaware of their presence. Thompson's men moved into ambush positions beside the track and waited until the lead soldier was only 4 metres away before opening fire. The operational report afterward was almost clinical in its precision. The leading man was struck by 8 rifle rounds and 6 rounds from an Owen submachine gun. The second man by 10 rifle rounds and 6 more from the Owen gun. Both died instantly. The Australians were already moving before the rest of the Indonesian patrol could organise a response. The planned attack on the airfield itself never went ahead. The reconnaissance had done its job, and the mission simply evaporated, the way so many of these operations did, without ever producing the dramatic set piece it had been planned around. 2 days after that, on the 3rd of July, Sergeant John Pettit took his own patrol south, reaching the Deadlier River by the following day and establishing watch over a stretch of its bank. On the 5th, they saw Indonesian boats moving up and down river, paddlers stripped to their shorts, each craft seemingly commanded by a man in an olive green shirt. One boat began turning toward the Australians' position on the bank, as though its occupants meant to beach it there. When it was 10 metres out, Pettit's patrol opened fire. In under a minute, they poured 81 rifle rounds and 26 rounds from their own guns into that single boat. Not one man aboard managed to return fire. Pettit estimated 7 killed and 2 badly wounded. Later intelligence suggested 1 man had died instantly, and 3 more of their wounds. 2.5 weeks after that, on the 21st of July, another patrol spotted a motorized prahu carrying 6 men dressed as civilians. As it neared the bank, Lance Corporal Chris Jennison, manning a Bren gun, noticed rifles and webbing hidden beneath their feet. He opened fire before they could reach for them. 3 rounds struck the man in the bow and threw him into the water. 3 more were killed before they could move. The patrol withdrew without losing a man. By the time the first squadron's tour ended in August of 1965, they had killed 17 of the enemy for the loss of 1 man, and that 1 man had not fallen to the enemy at all. By any conventional military measure, it was an extraordinarily successful debut for a brand new regiment, one still finding its feet only a year after it had first been formed on paper. It had also, without fanfare, invaded the sovereign territory of a country that posed no direct threat to Australian shores, on the authority of a foreign general, under rules that forbade its own soldiers from ever admitting they had done so. Both of those things were true at once, and neither one cancelled the other out. The political ground shifted beneath the entire campaign that September. On the 30th, an attempted coup in Jakarta failed, but it fatally undermined Sukarno's authority, and, with it, much of the Indonesian military's appetite for continuing a war that was costing them heavily for very little return. What remained of the campaign on the ground was increasingly carried not by regular Indonesian soldiers, but by militia trained by Indonesia's own special forces, a unit that would later become known as Kopassus, and one that Australian veterans came to regard simply as a considerably more brutal opponent than the conscripts they had faced the year before. It would take months for the political shift in Jakarta to fully reach the jungle, but it had already begun, and the soldiers arriving for the war's second year would spend it facing a smaller but harder enemy than the one their predecessors had grown used to. In January of 1966, the 2nd Squadron arrived in Borneo under Major Hughes to relieve the 1st. Hughes later recalled, with a certain dry bitterness, the reception his men received from the conventional army staff at headquarters in Brunei, as if, he said, "We were an embuggerance factor. You know, we got rid of 1st Squadron last year. Now you buggers are here." He had, he admitted, a feeling he might be interfering with somebody's golf. The British soldiers of 22nd SAS's B Squadron, whom his men were replacing, gave him a very different welcome. The difference, Hughes said, was chalk and cheese. The training the squadron received at nearby Matang from their British counterparts was, by one of Hughes's sergeants, first-rate, with live fire exercises run under conditions closer to real combat than anything the Australians had trained under before, and EBAN border scouts attached to teach them tracking. It was here, too, that the squadron was introduced to the Claymore mine, an American design that scattered roughly 700 steel balls across a 60-degree arc when detonated. A British officer had developed a technique for linking several claymores together on a single firing cord for use in ambushes. The first time an Australian troop attempted it, the entire array failed to fire. His own stated priorities for the tour were reconnaissance first, hearts and minds second, providing border scouts for the 3rd Division 3rd, and air rescue 4th. As it turned out, that 4th priority would not be needed the way anyone expected. a month after 2nd Squadron arrived, in April of 1966, the 4th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment took over 3rd Battalion's old ground around Bau, relieving the 1st 10th Gurkha Rifles in almost the same positions their predecessors had occupied a year earlier. Operating out of fortified bases, they carried patrols across both sides of the border and kept up the same hearts and minds work that had by now become standard practice for every Commonwealth unit in the theatre, deliberately trying to starve Indonesian infiltrators of local support before a single shot was ever fired. In June, when 2 large parties of infiltrators pushed into the BOU area, 4th Battalion and the neighbouring 2nd 7th Gurkhas moved together to cut off their retreat, catching the withdrawing Indonesians twice and killing 4 for 2 wounded. It was as close as the conventional infantry ever came, in the war's final months, to fighting genuinely side by side with the Gurkha units they had spent a year quietly relieving and being relieved by in turn. The most physically violent night of 2nd Squadron's own deployment came early, on the 3rd of February 1966, and it did not even involve an Australian-led operation. 3 of the squadron's non-commissioned officers, Sergeant John Coleman and Corporals Frank Stiles and Jeff Ailes, joined a British 22nd SAS force of 50 men under Major Terry Hardy for a cross-border raid, moving into Kalimantan at last light, with a plan to strike an enemy camp at dawn. A heavy downpour cut visibility to almost nothing. At 10:30 that night, the force stumbled straight into the enemy position without warning. Coleman was with the leading troop as they scrambled up a steep track toward a clearing under machine gun fire from an Indonesian militia position. The attackers took cover in a flimsy hut, returned fire, and pulled back almost immediately. As they left the shelter, one soldier threw a phosphorus grenade that struck an upright post, rebounded, and exploded among his own men. Coleman later wrote about what came next with a plainness that says more than any adjective could. "We were not in a good tactical position," he wrote, "with our hut burning and a few of the blokes on fire, me included." Major Hardy called in artillery on the camp behind them, and the burning men ran for the river and threw themselves in. Coleman drifted downstream with several others, then crawled for 2 hours on his hands and knees through wild pig tracks before first light, before finally reaching a Gurkha patrol camp the following morning. The first thing the Gurkha medic there did was offer him a cigarette. Before this, Coleman said later, "I had never smoked. But with the burns and such, I sucked the bloody thing inside out, and from that day to this, I smoke." Stiles and Ailes made it out with him. None of the 3 Australians who had joined that British raid died that night. It was the last time 2nd Squadron fought as part of a British formation. From that point on, they carried out their own operations, restricted for the moment to a non-offensive role, and Hughes found the restriction exceptionally frustrating. "We had honed our fighting skills to a very sharp edge," he said, "and were unable to put them into practice." Whatever satisfaction there might have been in that restraint, the jungle itself was about to remind them, one final time, that the enemy was never the only danger on that border. On the 3rd of March, Lieutenant Kenneth Hudson, known to his patrol as Rock, led a 4-man reconnaissance team across the border and discovered fresh footprints belonging to what looked like a militia patrol. They followed the tracks to the edge of the flooded Sikayan River. Hudson's men pushed him to cross it. He refused, and when they returned to base, Hughes backed his decision without hesitation. 2 weeks later, on the 17th of March, the same patrol returned to the same stretch of river, and this time spotted what looked like an enemy base on the far bank. It was raining lightly. Hudson decided to attempt a night crossing for a closer look. They left their observation post at 3 o'clock in the morning, Hudson leading, with Privates Bob Moncrief, Frank Ayling, and Bruce Gabriel following behind him, each man gripping the belt of the soldier in front. The current was moving fast, and as they waded in at chest height, the riverbed dropped away suddenly beneath them, breaking their grip on one another. All 4 men were swept into the current at once. Ayling, a strong swimmer, found Gabriel in the darkness, and the 2 of them floated roughly 500 meters downstream before finally scrambling up the far bank together. There was no sign of Hudson or Moncrief. The survivors made their way back to their observation post, and when the other 2 men failed to return, they tried and failed to raise base by radio before striking out on foot for the border, reaching it at 5:30 that evening, still without contact. It was not until the following morning that they finally got through, and a helicopter reached them at midday. Hughes now faced an almost impossible task. He had to search for 2 missing men without using helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, or any large ground party, because any of those things risked revealing to the entire world exactly what an Australian patrol had been doing on the wrong side of that river in the first place. On the 23rd of March, Corporal Jeff Ailes, with Bruce Gabriel guiding him, took a small patrol back into the search area. They searched for 5 days and found nothing. The Army released the names of the 2 men lost. It said nothing at all about how or where. It would be more than 4 decades before the remains of Kenneth Hudson and Bob Moncrief were finally recovered, in 2009, and repatriated to Australia the following year. 2nd Squadron finished its own tour a few months later, having lost 2 men to a river crossing that the enemy never fired a shot in, on a mission so sensitive that even the manner of their deaths could not be shared with the 2 families waiting at home for an explanation that would not properly arrive for 44 years. By March of 1966, even as Hughes searched a flooded river for his missing men, the political war behind the shooting war was already effectively over. General Suharto had spent the months since the failed coup steadily consolidating power in Jakarta. And on the 11th of that same March, Sukarno formally transferred the machinery of government into Suharto's hands, keeping the title of president for a while longer, but very little of the authority that came with it. 3 days after Hudson and Moncrief went into that river, the men who would end the war by other means were already on their way to a negotiating table. On the 25th of May, 1966, a party of senior Indonesian officers flew to Kuala Lumpur to open peace talks. And 3 days later, orders reached British SAS headquarters in Labuan. Every Claret operation, effective immediately, was to cease. On the 21st of July, 2nd Squadron was relieved by D Squadron of the 22nd SAS, and 5 days after that, the Australians flew out of Kuching for the RAF base at Butterworth. The same aircraft and the same 6 flights a month rhythm that had carried them into the theatre 18 months earlier, now carrying the last of them home. After a short period of rest in Penang, all of them were back at Swanbourne by the 15th of August, walking back into ordinary Australian life with a story they were legally required not to tell. 6 days earlier, on the 11th of August, Indonesia and Malaysia had signed a peace treaty in Bangkok, formally ending confrontation for good. Even before that treaty was signed, though, the regiment was already being pulled apart and reassembled for a different war. Major John Murphy, who had served with United States Special Forces in Vietnam, arrived to take command of 3rd Squadron for its own coming deployment, and he moved quickly to replace a number of Borneo veterans he judged insufficiently flexible for the faster, more American-influenced tempo he expected to find. Nobody made a fuss about it, and no complaint survives from the men who were shuffled quietly aside. They had fought a secret war nobody would acknowledge for decades, and now some of them found themselves judged not good enough for the next one, without ever having been told publicly that they had won the last. When the final tally of confrontation was added up, it read like this: 23 Australians had been killed, 7 of them directly on operations, and 8 had been wounded, out of roughly 3,500 personnel committed to the campaign. Across the entire Commonwealth force, 114 men had been killed, and 181 wounded. Indonesian losses were estimated at somewhere around 590 killed and 222 wounded, a ratio so lopsided it left little doubt about which side had dominated the fighting on the ground. Within the Special Air Service Regiment specifically, 3 men had died in Borneo. Paul Denhay, gored by an elephant. Kenneth Hudson and Bob Moncrief, drowned in a flooded river. Not one of them had been killed by enemy fire, even as SASR patrols killed at least 20 Indonesian soldiers of their own in a string of ambushes across 2 tours, on top of everything 3rd and 4th Battalions had accounted for along the same stretch of border. Nature and misadventure had taken more Australian SAS lives in Borneo than the Indonesian Army ever managed to. That irony would not turn out to be the strangest thing about Borneo. The strangest thing was that, officially, almost none of it had happened at all. Not for another 3 decades. The same deniability that let Operation Claret succeed tactically was the same machinery that erased it from public memory. Families of the dead and wounded were told, as a matter of settled government policy, that their sons had fallen safely inside Malaysian territory, when in truth many of them had died on the wrong side of a border their own country refused to admit they had ever crossed. Britain did not publicly disclose the existence of Claret until 1974, 9 years after Denhay died in that Indonesian jungle. Australia did not officially acknowledge its own involvement until 1996, 31 years after the fact, long enough that most of the men who had fought that secret war had already spent the greater part of their adult lives unable to say a single true word about it, even to their own families. The strategy's own architect had already told the world exactly what he'd built it to do, an honest description, in the end, of a plan constructed entirely on institutionalized dishonesty. And the reckoning, when it finally came, arrived on a scale almost comically small beside what Australia's soldiers would face in wars still to come. In 2013, a Defence Honours Tribunal sat down to formally consider whether Stephen Bloomfield, the medic who had spent days alone across an enemy border, tending to a dying friend, radioing a headquarters that could offer him nothing, deserved retrospective recognition for what he had done. 48 years after the fact. The machine that had made the entire campaign possible had also made sure almost nobody would know, for a very long time, that there was anything left to recognize. And yet, the machine outlived its own secrecy. What Borneo taught the Special Air Service Regiment did not stay buried along with the paperwork. The 4-man patrol, the reconnaissance and ambush doctrine, the discipline of operating far from any conventional chain of command, all of it travelled directly into Vietnam, where 3rd Squadron deployed in June of 1966, before 2nd Squadron had even finished packing up in Borneo. There was no pause between the 2 wars, no time set aside to properly close the book on the first one before opening the second. It was in Vietnam, in the years that followed, that the regiment earned the nickname history would remember it by. Vietnamese soldiers came to call the patrols who moved through their own jungles without ever quite being seen. Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, a name that could just as easily have been earned first, quietly, in Borneo. In 2024, the SAS Historical Foundation commissioned a memorial artwork to mark the 60th anniversary of Paul Denhay's death and Stephen Bloomfield's ordeal. Proof that this particular corner of history is still, even now, being actively remembered rather than quietly filed away. And the partnership forged in that jungle has never really ended. Between 2023 and 2025, soldiers of the Royal Gurkha Rifles trained alongside the 5th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment and United States Marines in the Australian outback, in joint exercises explicitly framed as continuing an Indo-Pacific defence relationship, whose roots trace directly back to this campaign. A peer-reviewed reassessment, published in 2024, by a scholar at Malaysia's own National Defence University, argued that the Special Air Service Regiment's tactical footprint in Konfrontasi had been modest, but that its strategic value had been disproportionately high, laying the foundation for what a companion academic paper the same year would call, in its own title, Mateship All the Way, an Australia-Malaysia security relationship that persists to this day, amid a very different set of regional anxieties. Not every historian agrees on how much credit the old Hearts and Minds campaigns in Borneo actually deserve. Other scholarship published that same year pushed back hard against the tidier version of that story, arguing the whole concept had always been more useful as propaganda, a comforting story Commonwealth planners told themselves and each other, than as an accurate description of what had actually won the war on the ground. The historiography, in other words, is still being fought over, on paper, more than half a century after the actual fighting stopped. Across both Borneo and the jungle war in Vietnam that followed it almost without a pause, the regiment those first two squadrons had built from nothing would go on to mount more than 1,400 patrols, tracking the movements of upward of 5,600 enemy soldiers and fighting close to 300 separate contacts. A body of experience that began, in its entirety, with 4 men walking a borderline for 6 days in the middle of 1965, not yet knowing what was waiting for them on the other side of it. There is no single, tidy way to close a story like this one. A signaller died alone in a jungle, killed by an elephant, while a medic who had never smoked a cigarette in his life stayed beside him and begged a silent radio for help that could not come without giving away a secret war. A sergeant was set alight by his own patrol's grenade, floated burning down a river to safety, and was handed his first cigarette by a Gurkha soldier who asked him nothing at all. A lieutenant and a private vanished into a flooded river on a mission so secret that the men searching for them could not even use a helicopter to look. None of them died fighting Indonesians. All 3 deaths happened because Australia had agreed to send its newest, least tested soldiers into a war. It would spend the next 31 years denying it had fought, while quietly asking its infantry battalions to fight and die under the exact same silence, mile after mile of the same unacknowledged border. What this story actually asks of anyone remembering it is not a single verdict about whether Borneo was worth it. It is the harder discipline of holding 2 things at once. That a young regiment proved in its very first campaign that it could be trusted with the same impossible, secret mission the Gurkhas had already spent a decade earning the right to carry, and that the country which sent them there chose, for 3 decades, to say that none of it had ever taken place. So tell me in the comments, honestly, when a country trusts a handful of its soldiers with a secret that large for that long, what does it actually owe them once the secret finally comes out? If you want to see what else stayed buried in the jungles of Borneo, and what the men on the other side of that border remember about the same nights, watch this next.